This week, we're going back to January of 2013 when Ben Shapiro joined me, conservative pundit, activist, journalist, call him what you will, Ben Shapiro. The topic was guns and just trying to find some way to bridge the left-right gap to reduce gun-related deaths. And he made a number of comments during this interview that a lot of people really didn't like, including sort of the racially tinged suggestions that it's urban sons of single mothers that are the problem when it comes to gun violence and really how we should be focusing our efforts. In any case, the big victory was we managed to have a somewhat cordial conversation. So we'll go back to my interview with Ben Shapiro, January 2013. Joining me is Ben Shapiro. He's Breitbart News Editor at large, also author of the new book, Bullies, How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences America. So, Ben, I saw your recent appearance with Piers Morgan. It was very, very entertaining. I think you did way better than Alex Jones did. I'm hoping, though, that we can have really kind of a productive conversation. I mean, we're the same age. We have similar backgrounds. Both have families with ties to the Holocaust and Eastern Europe. And politically, we are very, very different. But that being said, I would love to see if we can get any kind of consensus on, assuming that we're both kind of in good faith, really have the goal of reducing the number of people killed by guns in the U.S., which I believe that you do, and I know, speaking for myself, that I do. Can we come to some kind of consensus about really what would help, putting aside whether those solutions would fall under Democratic or Republican ideas? So I would hope so. A good place to start, I think, Ben, is what do you think really is the cause of gun violence in this country? I mean, is it education? Is it the wrong people having guns? Is it too many guns? Is it not enough guns, as some people have said? Is it liberals? I mean, what is the problem?
No, I mean, I think the problem is culture. What you see is a vast variety of differences, gun laws and gun effects. I mean, New Hampshire has virtually no gun laws. It has the lowest gun violence crime rate in the nation. Chicago obviously has tremendously heavy gun laws and has one of the highest gun violence rates in the nation. More people were killed in Chicago by handguns last year than were killed in Afghanistan among coalition troops last year. So yeah, I think that the bottom line is this. It comes down to culture, and how do we inculcate a culture that really, takes violence seriously and takes gun ownership seriously. And that may mean tailored solutions for different cultural backgrounds, but that seems to me the real root of the problem. Otherwise, we can pass as many gun laws as we want, but the truth is this: Britain has a lot of gun laws on the books. They have 5 times our violent crime rate. So if we really want to end not just gun violence but violence, then that's going to take a shift in culture more generally.
Yeah, and part of what you're saying I completely agree with. I mean, if we look at Switzerland, I think Switzerland is a good example where we actually have government-provided guns with a lot of training for people who live in Switzerland. The guns are then kept in people's homes. There's tons of guns in Switzerland, but you don't actually have much gun crime at all. So I think the problem is I'm not actually against. Whether I'm for or against guns in the abstract, I think is less relevant. For whatever reason, Americans are committing violence with guns, and that's really, I think, the problem we have to focus on, right?
It's not all Americans. I mean, I think that we have to distinguish between groups. It's easy to say, all of America has a gun violence problem, but it's also not true, right? New Hampshire and Vermont do not have a gun violence problem. Chicago does have a gun violence problem. Washington, D.C. has a gun violence problem. Big cities that are heavily populated across the United States seem to have much more of a gun problem than more rural areas, even if the gun ownership rate is higher in the rural areas. So we have to be looking at solutions that will actually work. And the truth is that broadly tailored solution, I mean, it's possible there's a different solution for Chicago than there is for Montana. But I think that we have to be as careful and meticulous in crafting solutions as we can.
So my concern when you said that before was we may need to craft solutions that are tailored for each culture. It starts to border. That could be interpreted as saying it needs to be determined by race, potentially. I mean, along what lines? Explain more, because I don't want you to be accused of that if that's not what you mean.
Yeah, no, this has nothing to do with race. This has to do with profiling really young men between the ages of all races, between the ages of about 16 and 25. That most of the gun violence in this country is committed by young men aged 16 to 25. Men who come from predominantly single mother backgrounds, who have poor levels of education, who grew up in poverty. Those would be good weighing factors. And what we have to do is we have to create a culture with strong male role models, a culture where people have the opportunity to get out of poverty, and a culture. Honestly, we need to jail more criminals. I mean, one of the biggest problems that we see is that if you keep criminals off the streets, they can't be out committing crimes. We see recidivism and criminals committing multiple crimes. So
Okay, but let's stop there for a second, because I'm glad you're getting to the jail thing, because I think this is a big factor. Specifically, what types of criminals do you want to jail? Because I actually think that a lot of the problem, maybe you're talking about different criminals than I'm thinking of, but I think the drug war is a big factor here. I think the fact that we have this criminalization of even marijuana in many cases, which is creating dangerous situations. If we had marijuana, for example, which I don't smoke weed. This is not a personal thing for me, but I think that if we eliminated the entire culture that's surrounded by marijuana being something that's illegal, we would eliminate a ton of gun crime.
I think there may be truth to that. I'm actually very torn on the marijuana legislation because I don't think that it's been effective, and I don't think that it's effectively enforced. I do tend to think that the folks who are committing criminal acts will find another market, shall we say, with illegal substances that will allow them to engage their best, their most marketable attributes, which in this case seems to be violence and illegal activity.
That may apply to some, but the vast majority of people who at least are purchasing marijuana, maybe that applies to some of the dealers, but a lot of these gunfights that start from people buying drugs, that'll go away, I think.
Well, most of the a lot of those gunfights that are starting from buying drugs, those are by people who are in the trade. I mean, when you're talking about the normal marijuana user, which is really what you're talking about here, drug dealers are not folks who we need to find a way to let off the hook. I think that drug users may be. That's a whole different discussion. But
essentially, we're talking about the government sanctioning and regulating those drug dealers, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, but the question is, what happens to the drug dealers?
Right.
Right. I don't think they're going to become pharmacists.
So let's go back to the thing, which is which criminals do you want to put in jails? Because I think jail population being completely blown up is part of the problem here.
Oh, see, I disagree. I think the easiest way to keep criminals from committing crimes is to not have them in the general population. So anybody who's convicted of a violent crime should be spending longer in prison, not less time. I mean, in the state of California, there was this crazy case that happened a few weeks back where a guy was let out of prison based on an old rape law.
We covered it, yeah.
His original sentence for rape was 3 years. I mean, that's insanity. Serving 3 years for a rape is craziness. So,
I agree with that. Okay.
The violent crime needs to be. We need more police forces. We need heavier police forces, and we need more police presence in downtrodden areas in order to really have a presence in crime heavy neighborhoods. All of that needs to happen. As far as what I like about this, David, and I appreciate it, is that we're having a discussion about the crime areas. Right? We're not having a discussion about what has to happen to 300 million Americans in order to make sure that we don't have Sandy Hook. We're having a discussion on how do we target the folks who are responsible for things like Sandy Hook or like the gun violence in Chicago. And
that's fine. And I agree with you on having this conversation. But I think if we are talking about gun violence, we can't ignore the specifics of guns. So I would love to get you to comment on that a little bit. I mean, I think we agree on one thing, which is assault weapons bans are not the solution, particularly simply because of the fact that it's mostly handguns when we talk about the homicides over a year that are leading to deaths. Now, you asked Piers Morgan, why don't you just say you want to ban all handguns? And he was reticent to do that, and whatever reasons he had, I don't know. But asking you, should anything happen with guns? Should there be more guns, less guns? What do we do about the guns specifically?
More guns in the hands of people who are responsible and less guns in the hands of people who are irresponsible. So that's why I said on the show, I'm in favor of background checks. I have no problem with background checks. And generally speaking, I don't have a problem with the idea that you have to be trained to own a gun so that you actually know what you're doing with it. These are all things that I don't see as significantly burdensome to obtaining a gun. Now, I understand the argument of people like John Lott, with whom I'm friends, that creating more barriers means that it's a longer time between when you can apply for a gun and when you can get it, and in many cases you don't have that much time. But
here's the thing. Let me stop there, though. If you're really in a situation where having to wait a week or two to get a gun is specifically putting your life in danger, you should really be in touch with law enforcement. I don't think that that's a legitimate thing.
I think there. let's put it this way. I think that there are exceptions to that rule, but I think generally that's correct. I don't think law enforcement can do everything, though. So I'm more sympathetic to it than you are, but I understand your argument, and I sort of agree with it.
Okay, so then let's get to the other aspect, which is I think where you started to lose some people when you were talking to Piers Morgan is when we go into this issue of to defend ourselves from the government, which may become tyrannical. I understand that in a theoretical world this is possible, but I think you lose a lot of people when you go into that argument. That doesn't appeal to as many people as I respect the Second Amendment.
Well, I agree, but the problem is this, and this is really the fundamental issue, and this is why I went there with Piers. I think it is very, very, very important that when we say that we support the Second Amendment, we understand why we support it. And people on the left, many of them, and it doesn't have to be a left-right issue, but the folks who are pro-gun control, they say they support the Second Amendment, but then they can't explain why they don't want a blanket gun ban. And you saw that with Piers, that he wouldn't come out in favor of a blanket handgun ban. Now, every justification that he had used for banning, for example, AR-15s is doubly true with regard to handguns. But he wasn't talking about that. And so, all I want from the left is a cohesive. Like, I know why I defend the Second Amendment. I really do. Like, I do defend it on the basis that the founders defended it, which is that an armed population is the best guarantee against tyranny. But if you don't agree with that, then I think that it's important for people. Let's say you're a Second Amendment articulate the rationale behind why you defend the Second Amendment. Why is it good for people to own guns? Because for Piers Morgan, later in that same show after I left, he admitted it, that if he had his druthers, he would get rid of all guns on American soil.
Yeah, the only thing is that Justice Antonin Scalia has said a lot of the same things that Piers Morgan has said. I think that we get a little muddled when we talk about exactly what the founders intended, because let's be honest, everything was very different when the founders wrote that Second Amendment. So I don't know that just saying I don't like the focus on the commas in the Second Amendment, so to speak.
Well, right, but no, I don't think that's true, though. I think that the Second Amendment is largely about human nature, and the fact is that we have seen tyranny on American soil. I mean, we had 120,000 Japanese folks who were imprisoned during World War II. We had Jim Crow in the South for 100 years. We had slavery in this country for 80 years after the Declaration of Independence. So, I think that it's a mistake to imagine that democracy, the best guarantee, I mean, if you read the Second Amendment, it's not about the commas. The Second Amendment is very clear on why it's there, right? I mean, it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the preservation of a free state. I mean, that is the point. The free state is the point, is that and a well-regulated militia meant every person age 16 to 45. I mean, that's in U.S. code.
Where do you draw the line on what specifically in terms of arms and weapons are allowed? In other words, my interpretation, and this may be not nuanced enough. I say there are kind of two options in my mind. Either it applies to the weapons that were available when the Second Amendment was written, or there are absolutely no restrictions, and this goes to shoulder-mounted RPGs and everything. And let me just finish my thought here. If we are able to draw lines somewhere, the lines that the NRA wants to draw are no more or less legitimate than the lines President Obama or Dianne Feinstein may want to draw.
I disagree with that. And the reason I disagree with that is because I think that you can draw lines based on the principle. Now, the Second Amendment was not written for muskets. It was, and proof is in the pudding. If we're going to be that literal about the Second Amendment, and the Second Amendment says arms, it doesn't say muskets. If we're going to assume that it just meant stuff that happened at the time, then Piers Morgan has no right to be on TV because there were no TVs in 1789. And the freedom of the press doesn't use a printing press. So, I mean, as long as we're going to go there, we may as well go all the way. And that's
so then where do we limit to RPGs or nuclear arms? Those are arms, right?
No, they're not actually. If you look at the Second Amendment doesn't guarantee your right to own a warship, right? It doesn't guarantee your right to own a cannon. Even back.
But hold on a second. One of the main tenets of those who are constitutionalists is that the Constitution only says what you can't do, and the Second Amendment doesn't say you can't own a warship.
No, correct. No, the Second Amendment. No, that is true. The Second Amendment doesn't
They're negative,
say that.
Right? So in other words, it's not actually. You're wrong on that.
It prevents the government from infringing in areas where it says that you can't infringe. So that is actually this was the argument about the Bill of Rights at the time. Actually, the Bill of Rights are kind of different from the rest of the Constitution in that they carve out areas that the government cannot go. That's why there was argument about the Bill of Rights. The Constitution is a document of negative liberties. The Bill of Rights is also a document of negative liberties, but it carves out actual spaces where government can't go. That's why, I mean, you know this. This is why there was the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Anti-Federalists said there's no point to a Bill of Rights. It actually infringes our liberty because it says to the government that it can go all these other areas. The Second Amendment said, when it says that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, it also it doesn't. First of all, the Second Amendment applies to the federal government, not to the states. But that is a huge thing that has been overlooked in constitutional history. But even assuming that it applies to the states, the fact is that the state has always had and always did have the ability to prevent private citizens from owning cannon. I mean, there were laws on the books when the Constitution was written preventing people from owning certain types of weaponry.
So the argument you're making now is actually that the Second Amendment does not prevent anybody from owning warships, but it's the states superseding that Bill of Rights that would allow them to prevent someone from owning a warship. It's getting a little muddled, right?
It's not, though. I mean, that's correct. The Second Amendment doesn't prevent you from doing anything. I mean, the First Amendment doesn't prevent you from doing anything.
So you're okay with the states drawing the lines on what guns you can have, but not the federal government?
It's a restriction on government, right? I mean, the Second Amendment is not created as a restriction on individual. It's not a law about what guns you can and cannot own. It's a restriction on what the state can do. And what it says that the state can do is it says that the state is not allowed to infringe your right to bear arms. Now the question becomes, what is the definition of arms, right?
So I think most likely, this is interesting because we could probably go on 20 more minutes and we probably wouldn't come to an agreement on this. But I think this is really, we were doing fine agreeing on a lot of stuff until we got to this. And I think this is where a lot of people are getting lost also, I think.
It's a very simple argument from my point of view. And that is that people, if they have the right to bear arms in order to prevent tyranny, then that goes for arms to prevent. That goes to the ultimate limit of that is the arms necessary to prevent. Basically, you can own any arm that is necessary, not to prevent tyranny.
Well, this is good because in Waco, Texas, the government used tanks. Isn't it then reasonable to say people need tanks because they were used in Waco, Texas?
Because this is the balance that we draw. Right, and this is true for all legislation.
It's totally subjective, though, Ben.
It's not totally subjective. The fact is that if you disarm a population of rifles, there is no chance that there could be a popular resistance to tyranny. Period.
And if you only give them rifles and the tanks roll out, the rifles are useless.
True. It's just not true. I mean, I've spoken to veterans at the War College who have done studies of what would happen in case of an armed insurrection in the United States. If the American population is armed with semi-automatic rifles, the Army cannot handle them. Now, God forbid it should ever come to that point, obviously, okay. And I don't think near that point now. But the argument that you need tanks in order to resist tyranny is not true. And obviously the menace to public safety provided by tanks is significantly higher than the menace provided by a semi-automatic rifle, which, as you said, is not really the main threat in gun violence anyway.
All right. Well, I think on this issue, I think it's a fascinating discussion. Obviously, we're not going to agree, but hopefully the audience will be able to get some interesting stuff from this discussion. We've been speaking with Ben Shapiro, Breitbart News Editor at Large. The book is Bullies: How the Left's Culture of Fear and Intimidation Silences America. Ben, really great to have you on. Would love to have you back again.
It was a blast.